Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk about climate change. Right when you introduced me, I actually also work on a lot of other problems together with a lot of economists and nice people too. And I would love to talk about that as well, but that's not the talk I've been invited to do, and that's not the talk that I have on the slides. So I'm going to be talking about climate, but remember, and I think we'll have that coming up in some of the questions, there's a lot of other issues in the world, and I think one of the ways we talk smarter about climate is also to get people to realize most people on this planet actually suffers from many, many other things apart from climate. But with that said, can I get my slides up? Because I'm going to show you a lot of data. I'm a statistician, right? I think data is sexy. But fundamentally, thank you. And that was just one guy, right? So I'm going to get out of this way. As you also heard, I'm a political scientist. I'm sort of a pretend economist. I'm not going to go into the whole conversation on global warming. I simply take that as a granted. Yes, there is global warming. Yes, it's man-made. Yes, it is an important problem. I'll show you some of the evidence on that. But that's not the main point that I'm trying to make. It is much more that a lot of the conversation around global warming is vastly exaggerated. You hear it all the time, but it matters. A recent survey of OECD countries, so all the rich countries in the world, showed that now about 60% of all people in the rich countries believe that global warming will likely, or very likely, lead to the end of mankind. Now, if that's really true, then that's obviously terrible. I mean, this is really something that means people are worried sick. It's not just youngsters anymore. It really is everyone who thinks this is a terrible thing that's coming at us. And that's, of course, why we need to do everything in our power to deal with it. That makes perfect sense. I don't know if you remember when AOC was talking about this back in 2018. But I think in some ways it's important to understand where this comes from, because if you think this is the end of the world, it actually makes perfect sense what she said and many others. I live in Sweden now, where Greta Thunberg lives, and I think it makes sense to realize, if you think this is the end of the world, if you think this is a meteor hurtling towards Earth, there's really no other thing that you should be concerned about, right? The only thing, if this was a meteor, huge meteor that's going to eradicate all of humankind, the only thing we have to do is to get Bruce Willis and the guys out of retirement and get up and do something about that, right? So the truth here is, unless we get to understand this is not the end of the world, we're not going to have the rest of the conversation sensible. And so I'm getting back to the AOC point. She said back in 2018, when a lot of people told us we had 12 years left to save the planet, she said, and I think it makes sense, she said, we have 12 years left to save the planet, and you're worried about how much it's going to cost? That makes sense. If this is the end of the world, we should just spend everything. I want to show you why this is not the end of the world. It's a problem, not the end of the world, and that matters a lot. So let me show you some of these slides. So first of all, you've all heard this, but I just want to sort of set the stage. This is Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, but almost every Western leader and many others will mimic these sorts of claims. He'll tell you the world is facing a grave climate emergency. Every week brings new climate-related devastation, floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, superstorms. We're in a battle for our lives, and climate change is the biggest threat to the global economy. I think this is stories that we can all recognize. We hear them constantly in our news feeds, and it certainly is what the current administration and many around the world is also saying. This is an existential threat. This really is the question about whether you, and especially your kids, will be able to survive in this world. And again, that's the gambit of saying Hence, we should pay up anything this will cost. But let's just get a sense, and I'm just going to take you through a few of these. I'd like to talk for about 35 more minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Guterres, many others talk about these superstorms that we're all going to be hit by terrible hurricanes. Well, what do we actually know? If you ask the UN climate panel, and again, I take the starting point here, I think they are actually, please don't read them, it's like 4,000 pages, it's incredibly boring, but they're actually pretty good, most of the stuff. If you look at what they say about the past, is that fundamentally we have very, very little knowledge about it. Identifying past trends in tropical cyclones, as they call hurricanes, remains a challenge. We have low confidence in most reported long-term trends. I'm going to show you the one that we do actually have confidence in. And in the future, they expect that we're going to see more strong hurricanes, which is a problem. We're also probably going to see few total hurricanes, which is a good thing. But it turns out when you add those two things, overall, fewer hurricanes, but stronger hurricanes means that it's going to be worse overall. So this is one of the many reasons why global warming is a real problem. It is a problem, but it's not the end of the world. And let me just show you that. So if we look, for instance, on hurricanes for US, we have some of the longest statistics for the US. Again, if you look out in the middle of the ocean, there were no satellites back in 1900, right? So you don't know what happened out there. But we do know that landfalling hurricanes were very likely to have been observed at least since 1900. So we have a good record of how many landfalling hurricanes have there been in the US since 1900. It turns out that the number is slightly declining. It's not increasing, contrary to what you hear. And then when people say, but surely we see more and more strong hurricanes, well, actually, if you look at the same thing for major hurricane 3, category 3 and above, the same thing, again, slightly declining, not increasing. The point here is the data tells you something else than what the common story is. If you think about it, it makes good sense. It's a little bit the same thing as if you looked at what happened, at least for the last 30 years in the US, the FBI statistics for about 30 years, maybe not the last couple of years, showed strong decline in all crime in the US. Yet every year when Gallup asked people, every year people said there's more and more crime. And that's true. Where is there more and more crime? There's more and more crime on TV, right? This is the CNN effect, right? It's essentially the fact that we have replaced seeing once a day that there was some crime. Now we can see it wall to wall on all channels all the time. You're not well informed if you take your statistics from just watching more and more cable news. And this is essentially the same thing we're doing when we're hearing more and more about hurricanes. We're hearing more and more about all kinds of weird weather. It's not surprising because nobody takes cameras out and say, I'm out here and reporting and there's nothing. Nothing is happening, right? It's always something happening, right? And that's, of course, why we get scared. Let me show you, sorry, I should just also mention, we actually have good data. I just showed you the one for the US, but if we look at the world, we have good data since satellites. And if you look at the total hurricane energy, actually, last year, 2022, was the second lowest ever. Did you hear that anywhere? No, because that's not a fun story, right? That's this, I'm here and there's nothing to report. You don't do that. It's no fun, but it's not a good way to inform us. Actually, we believe that in the future, hurricanes will be worse overall. Global warming will be a problem, but it's not what we're seeing in the statistics, and we need to show this both to our kids so they stop being scared witless, but also to everyone else to realize this is not an end-of-the-world situation. Let me show you one other thing, and I've just shown you wildfire. This is such great clips, right? I mean, who don't want to click on this? But again, we're constantly being shown pictures of places where it burns, not where it doesn't burn. Do you guys remember the big forest fires in Australia in 2019-20? After that had happened, I actually went back because we have satellite coverage for this. And what it turned out was there was enormously much fire close to where news crews live, that is, Sydney and Melbourne. But actually, overall for Australia, it was one of the lowest burned years of fire ever. Were you well informed if you only saw what the guys in Sydney and Melbourne saw? No. That's again the whole point. We need to look at the statistics. So let me show you, if you look at global fire, we have pretty good data since 1900. This is model data, but it's data that is used by the UN Climate Panel to feed into the climate models. And what we've seen is about in early 1900, about 4.2% of the world's surface burnt every year. And since then, what you see is it's actually been declining. Very contrary to what you probably have heard. But now we have satellite data, satellites that cross the world all the time, discover where does it burn. So we have much better data, and this is what they show for the last 25 years, a dramatic decline. This is something that science and nature and everybody else has written about, but it's not what you see, right? You see more and more fire in the TV, despite the fact that this is what the data tells you. And if you look out into the future, what is likely to happen if we do nothing about climate? Well, we'll probably see even less fire. Now, if we have strong climate policy, we will see even less fire. So yes, there is a point here, but it's not that the world is going to burn up, as New York Times love to point out, but it is a fact that we have seen less and less fire in the world, and if we do, for instance, climate policy, we can see even less. But it's not that the whole world is burning up. Again, we need to know these facts. Why is it declining? Because most people don't like fire. So we actually actively try to suppress fire. We try to avoid fire. We're a smart species. But again, we seem to forget this very often, and I would actually argue that's probably one of the reasons why we have a really hard time having a sensible conversation about climate, because we only talk about what will climate do, but not what will humans do. So that's my point in saying basically we miss adaptation. Let me show you. What happens here if you look at deaths from climate, we have pretty good data over the last 100 years. How many people die from climate? So that would be floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures. It turns out that 100 years ago, in the 1920s, on average, about 500,000 people died each and every year on average. This is a very, very fluctuating, so I'm taking the average per decade. Since then, if you listen to the climate sort of alarmism, you'd imagine that it's just gone up and up. You can kind of see it doesn't, because I've already set the chart up here, right? But what it does is it's incredibly declined over the last 100 years. In the 2010s, the average number of people dying from climate-related disasters was 18,000. These are the last 3 years, so 2020, 21, and 22. These are the years that you constantly hear about, oh my God, all these people are dying. And yes, in 2022, there were 11,000 people dying. We certainly heard about some of them in news. We also didn't hear about a lot of them. About 1,000 of them were from Indian floods that you probably never heard of. But the important point is, when you count all of them, they're much, much smaller today than they used to be 100 years ago. Again, why? Because we're rich. Because we're much smarter. We have much better prediction. We have much better technology. We're much better able to avoid people dying from these disasters. It has nothing to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact that we're much better able to adapt. And of course, this also sends an important message to how do you want to help people to avoid these kinds of problems in the future? You do that by making sure that they're rich, that they're able to deal with these issues, that they're able to be resilient in the face of natural catastrophes.